Our final witness tonight is a man that in some respects needs no introduction. Judge Lou Trosch is famous here in the city of Charlotte for the work that he has done over the years. He is about to tell a bit of his own story about his, dare I say, becoming woke. So let me, before I say anything else, I don't want to steal any of your thunder, Judge Lou Trosch. After Judge Trosch speaks, I might have a question or two for him, and then Reverend Greg Gerald will provide summary remarks for him.
Thank you, Reverend Sadler, and I also want to thank you for having me go after our incredible witnesses, Ms. McCarthy, Mr. Armstrong, and especially Mr. Dean. I feel like just dropping the mic, and based on what we've heard tonight, it really was amazing. So I'm a judge here in Mecklenburg County. I've been a judge. This is my little green screen. I'm not really actually sitting in front of the courthouse right now, but that's where I work every day, and I've been a judge for 20 years. And you know, judges view ourselves differently. We take an oath to be neutral, right? We're the neutral people. And we've recognized probably over the years, or I recognized for many years, and I've been a judge now for going on my 23rd year as a judge. And for many years, I thought, you know, there are others in the system, because you can't be blind to see that the people that come into my courtroom are brown and black young men. You've heard the stories from Mr. Armstrong, from Ms. McCarthy and Mr. Dean about their experiences, and that's what I saw every day. But that, as a judge, that wasn't my problem. At least that's what I thought, right? That maybe that's the police, maybe that's the prosecutors, maybe it's the prison officials, maybe it's probation officers, maybe it's the legislatures that make the laws, like the laws about crack cocaine versus powder cocaine. But after all, I'm a judge, and you know, our symbol is Lady Justice, so we're blind to bias, to discrimination. At least that's what I told myself for many years. And then I had some experiences, and one of those experiences really changed me. I was in court, I was in juvenile court, and I had two young men who were charged with an armed robbery. They were specifically charged with trying to rob a McDonald's here in Charlotte, in Matthews, actually. And I was scheduled to hear what's called a first appearance. First appearance, some of you may know, some of you may not know, is where right after you've been arrested for a serious charge, you go before the judge lets you know what the charge is that you have, what who your lawyer is going to be, and what you're facing, and then schedule another court date. In juvenile court, you also, because we don't have bail or bond in juvenile court, and so we set conditions of release or decide whether juveniles should remain in detention, because this was in juvenile court. At any rate, I've got a lot of cases that afternoon. So I've got a lot to do that afternoon. I've got the two young men that are charged with the armed robbery, and then a number of other cases. I figured it would be pretty perfunctory. I would go through the hearing and then move on. So I called the first case in. A young man came in from detention, as I expected he would be. Armed robbery is about as serious as it gets in juvenile court. And when I called him in, and he came in with the bailiff and sat down next to his attorney, a whole host of people came into the courtroom. His parents, his grandparents, some aunts and uncles, neighbors. The family had a stack of letters about this young man and how this was totally out of character for him. So I listened to what everybody had to say, and what I learned was that he and his co-defendant had watched this movie called Ocean's 11. Now, I'm old, I remember Ocean's 11. Some of you all may or may not remember it, but it's a movie about a heist that some people pulled on a casino, on an evil casino owner out in Las Vegas. So these two young men watched that movie and decide, oh, let's have our own heist. We don't have casinos, as you all know, here in Charlotte, but we do have a lot of McDonald's. So they go to the McDonald's, they try to commit this robbery, and it's an utter failure. They get arrested in the parking lot. So as I hear about the charge, and I've let him know about his lawyer and what he's facing, I am now trying to decide whether or not he needs to remain in detention. I hear from his family how this is out of character. He's never been in trouble, never been suspended from school. His pastor from his church came to the court hearing. He was very active in his church. He was not gang involved. There was no history of drug abuse. He had very strong family connections, et cetera, et cetera. None of the risk factors that we typically see in juvenile court that lead kids to get into a lot of trouble. I wasn't hearing any of that. And so I said to the family, well, let me hear the recommendations from my team. And I have a court team that works with me. So I have a district attorney, I have a prosecutor, I have a court counselor or a probation officer that makes recommendations. I have case managers, and I have a defense attorney, and we always work together. So I asked their recommendations, and the court counselor said, well, Judge, we think that he may be eligible for our alternatives to detention program, which means if what the family's saying checks out, then we can release him on an electronic monitor with intensive supervision and a list of requirements. And so I said, okay, well, that makes sense. I asked the district attorney their recommendation. She agreed that that was the right thing to do. The defense attorney, I asked what they thought, and they said, well, could we just come back sooner, Judge? Today's Monday. We'd like to come back on Thursday instead of waiting all the way until next Monday, because if this checks out, then we want this young man to get back into school. And so I asked everyone if that was doable, and they all agreed that it was. So we scheduled the hearing for Thursday. So he leaves the courtroom, the family leaves the courtroom, I call in the co-defendant. I wait for the co-defendant to come out of detention. I wait some more for the deputy to get him out of detention. And I finally, and meanwhile, the families come in again, a mom, dad, which I often don't see in juvenile court, but mom, dad, grandma, grandpa, a coach from the school came because he was really active on the sports team at school. They had letters, they all came in. And I finally turned to the deputy, a little irritated, and said, can you bring in our other co-defendant? I've got a lot of hearings to do today. And he looked at me and said, Judge, there's nobody else back there. Well, yes, there is. The co-defendant, he says, Judge, there's nobody else back in the holding cells. And about that time, I noticed that one of the people that had come into the courtroom was, in fact, the co-defendant, the other juvenile. He sits down by his attorney, and we go around. I hear more of the same information, ask for recommendations, same court counselor, same district attorney, same defense attorney, or I had a different defense attorney in this case, same case managers. And the recommendations were, Judge, we'd like him to stay on house arrest, to stay with his family, go to school every day, stay away from the co-defendant, sort of a standard list of pre-release conditions. And so I started asking questions, and I asked, we just had the co-defendant and he's in detention. Was he the gunman? And I heard, no, they both had guns. And I said, well, was it the other guy's idea? No, these guys have been best friends since they were 7 years old. They live one street over. They watched this movie and they came up with it together. Well, did the other young man make threats, or was he the leader or did he threaten the police, or what's going on? And as I asked more and more and more questions, there is literally no difference between these two young men whose families were friends, who lived one street over from one another, who committed the same offense. Both of them they turned out to be pellet guns, we found out later, but you may or may not know that pellet guns now are not like Red Ryder BB guns. They look like Glocks or 357. So they both had weapons or pellet guns. They were both equally involved, and yet one was in detention and one was not. And and the fact that probably everybody who's on this conference or call and commission hearing knows that one was white and one was black, and also knows that the white young man was with his family at home and the African-American young man was in a detention cell. And so I did at that point what Americans are taught to do when we look at a disparity or what appears to be discrimination. I looked for the racist in the room. I was trying to find Archie Bunker or Richard Spencer, the person who was intentionally trying to treat these two young men differently. maybe it was the police, maybe it was a district attorney, maybe it was the court counselor, maybe it was another judge who signed an order placing the young man in secured custody. I was looking for who that was. And as I looked around the room, I realized, wait a minute, I work with all of these individuals every day. They're my court team. They're also not all old white men like I am. I had women, men, Black, white workers, lawyers and case managers and court counselors, so people from all demographic groups. And yet, and I knew that they did not intentionally do this. They were trying to do the right thing. And as I asked the questions, I watched the light bulb go on over each of their heads as they realized, oh my gosh, we treated these two young men completely differently. And I realized something else was going on. And at that moment, I then had probably the scariest realization of all. How many times have I done the same thing? How many times have I, maybe not in a case that was this obvious, right? This was two young men doing the exact same thing, but maybe there was a little shade of a difference, or maybe it was two different times of the day. How many times have I treated unintentionally people completely different based on their race? And it brought me back to something that had happened a couple years earlier, well, 4 or 5 years before that, right when I came on the bench. So maybe it was like 7 years earlier. I was in abuse and neglect dependency court. And one of the attorneys, a very courageous and frankly, very kind to me lawyer, came to me and said, Judge, I'd like to talk to you. And she came to my chambers and we talked, and she said, look, I don't know how to tell you this, but there are some social workers that feel like you have different standards for families based on criteria that really doesn't have anything to do with the law. And I said, what are you talking about? And she said, well, you have different standards for African-American social workers or Hispanic social workers than you do for white social workers, and likewise families, or at least that's what some people are saying. She said, I don't think that. I think you're a jerk across the board, but there are people that think that you are more difficult with some families. And I will tell you, as a white man, my reaction, I thought that outwardly I was calm, cool, and collected, listening respectfully and responding respectfully. The reality probably was that I was very defensive, very questioning, and very ready to explain away why those perceptions were incorrect. Inside, I was feeling horrified, angry. How could someone think that of me? I'm not a racist, because again, my experience, all of our experiences, if you are accused of, or if you treat people differently, then you're Archie Bunker, then you're a bigot. And that's all I heard was I'm a bigot. And I'm like, I've done everything my whole life to be neutral, to not be this way. I can't believe they must be wrong. These perceptions are wrong. That was my first thought. And so we finished the meeting and I thought about it. I sat on it all weekend. And the next week, I asked the lawyer to come back out. We had some hearings, and I asked between hearings to talk to her. And I said, look, clearly, just because I don't think I'm doing it doesn't mean I'm not doing it. My perceptions are not the only perceptions in the world. And clearly, something is going on where I am giving off a vibe, or maybe I am treating people differently without even realizing I'm doing it. Can you help me? And again, to her benefit and to my guardian ad litem attorney's benefit, both of them agreed they would be my tickler system, my warning system. And they courageously, kindly, compassionately to me would kind of let me know. And over time, it really helped me see that sometimes you make assumptions. I think Mr. Dean or Mr. Armstrong mentioned implicit bias. And so that led me and some other people to a long journey to try and figure out what's going on besides the bad cop kneeling on somebody's neck. There's something larger going on. There's a systemic thing that's going on And I learned a lot, and we've learned a lot. So we started an initiative called Race Matters for Juvenile Justice and have gone on a long journey to figure out what is the court system's role? What is the school system's role? What is the police department's role? What is probation's role? What is the Department of Social Services role in creating these systems that either intentionally or even with best intentions, unintentionally treat people very, very differently? Implicit bias is one thing that we've learned about. Hiring practices is something else. You've heard a lot of the solutions that are ongoing tonight about economics, about opportunity, and it's changed the way I view my system. In fact, now what I recognize is, in order for me to treat people fairly, I have to acknowledge that I'm unfair. That if left to my own devices, I will have biases, and those biases will impact me. And my only chance to interrupt those biases is to recognize that I have them and then take active steps in order to mitigate or minimize those biases. So that's what I've striven personally to do, and judges in our juvenile courts and now across our court system are doing. In fact, we were just asked to present to all the Superior Court judges in North Carolina, and they had a similar presentation for district court judges about this concept of implicit bias and how it affects everybody, including Lady Justice and judges that are sitting in the courtroom. Nobody's really got a blindfold on, no matter how much we pretend that we do. I think I'll stop there, Reverend Sadler.
Well, thank you so much, Judge Trosch. It is always wonderful to hear this story and to know that you had an experience that helped you to see your role in a system that wasn't just, and then decided to atone for that, to find a way to make up and to help transform the system. First question I have for you is just a simple one. Were you keeping metrics about the way that people were experiencing the court system in terms of their race prior to that point? And if not, have you shifted your practices after that point?
So interestingly, you know, as history repeats itself, in the late 90s, there were some incidents with police officers and citizens that led to some unrest. And there was also a survey. You remember the recent survey about economic mobility in Charlotte's poor showing. Well, there was a survey about trust between races and ethnic groups in Charlotte in the 1990s. And I think Charlotte finished 49th out of 50 cities, you know, of the large cities. And so that's where the initiative or the organization CBI comes from, for example, the Community Building Initiative. And so the court system did a survey in conjunction with CBI where we looked at how people were fared in the courtroom and their perceptions about how they were treated. And interestingly, people that came to the court system, and this is in the 1990s, felt like, no, everybody's treated fairly. But people that worked in the system, the bailiffs, the clerks, the lawyers, realized that people were treated very differently based on factors, race being chief among them. Since that time, one of the things that we've done with Race Matters for Juvenile Justice is look at our numbers and our statistics, both with regard to, for example, in juvenile court, who is going to detention? What do they look like? What are the crimes that they're committing? And to divide that out demographically, which used to not happen. And so we've made tremendous progress in keeping the data now, not just with the court system, but also with our stakeholders, our partners in the juvenile court system.
Thank you for that. And just one other brief question for you.
Yeah.
This has to do with the fact that you tried to change a fairly substantial system. Have you found that change is possible? Does the system resist? How have you found the possibility for systemic change?
Yeah, there's always resistance. I think what we did, and what I'll give you an example real quickly. So the school system, for the first time, when Ann Clark she was active with Race Matters for Juvenile Justice, and she was the superintendent for a period of time. And during that period of time, they brought up the school system acknowledged or talked about their discipline rates with respect to race and the disproportionality and disparities. And when they were prepared for that discussion, what helped her bring it up and have that conversation with the school board and with all school leadership was all of the rest of us, the judges, police, I believe Vicky Foster may have been there, or at that time it may have been, no, I think it was Vicky, but at any rate, the head of the Department of Social Services, Peggy Egan at the time, or was Youth and Family Services, our chief probation officer, we all came to the meeting just to sit there and say, hey, we're all looking at this too. And that strength in numbers when you're not just pointing your finger at one system. And I think that's really important because we've been talking a lot about the police tonight. And everything that you've heard is a problem that needs to be addressed. But it ain't just the police. It's employers. It's the faith community. Hello. It's business. It is housing. It is schools. It is social services. It is across the health services. All of us do the same thing. The impacts are different. And for us, when our stakeholders recognized, hey, it's all of us, not just one of us, and we're going to not point the finger. We're going to point one finger at you, but we got 4 fingers or 3 fingers pointing back at ourselves. That's when we were able to begin breaking through some of those barriers. There's still barriers, though.
Yes.
Let's not kid ourselves.
Thank you so much. I couldn't have said it more eloquently than you just did. We have to examine each and every one of our systems to find out the way that they perpetuate these disparities, and then to begin to find ways to atone for what has been done. I appreciate that more than you will ever know. Reverend Gerald.
Let's see, Judge Trosch, thank you. Rodney, you just said that we have to examine our systems, and Judge Trosch, one of the things that you've done for us here is demonstrate that we also have to examine ourselves, and particularly as white people, as white men, working in systems that were designed to work for us and holding power within those systems. That self-examination takes some courage. It takes some courage because it sort of knocks down the world that was built around us where we thought we knew what was happening. And you've done that with a great deal of transparency and with a great deal of inward reflection. And so I just want to say thank you for that, for the way that you've exemplified that. I saw something come across in the chat, someone else, I think it was Smitty Flynn out there, saying how grateful he was to hear that story and to hear a man from your social location to acknowledge all that and to demonstrate how the work is done. So we thank you for that. And so that's what I want to reflect back to you at this point. So that's what I have to say for now, Rodney.
Thank you so much, Reverend Gerald. Judge Trosch, Reverend Gerald, thank you so much for all that you've added to this conversation tonight.